Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Daily Defender. Great to have you back. Glad you're coming back for part two, I guess as I'm calling it, of the April 11th, 1986 FBI Miami shootout. And as I mentioned at the beginning, kind of the intro video, we've talked through the hardware. And I think the other part that makes sense is the ballistics side of it and the ammunition and kind of where all this went. This is even probably, if you will, more interesting than the hardware. I mean, the hardware's amazing from a historical engineering. Some of the guns are just absolutely gorgeous from that standpoint. But what really happened here, and probably many of you know why and how the 40 Smith and Wesson became so um, dominant in law enforcement in the late 80s and 90s, and it is because of the FBI Miami shootout. And again, we've talked about that before on this channel when we've talked about certain guns and certain calibers. But let's take kind of a deep dive on that as best as I can. I'm not a ballistic expert, I'm not an author, but I do want to talk through a lot of the things that I've learned and heard and read and kind of give you guys maybe more information that maybe you did or didn't know. And again, the 800-pound gorilla in the room is the Smith & Wesson 9mm. The agents that had that, there were 3 SWAT agents that had that. And they were, again, utilizing the approved Winchester 9mm 115 grain silver tip. Now, as I said, this is back in the 80s. You have to really understand the where all of this bullet technology was, right? Semi-automatics were kind of just coming into play in the late 1960s, right? I've talked about the Smith & Wesson Model 39, the Illinois State Police, the Navy SEALs. The 70s then, at least for Smith & Wesson, keep the 39 and the 59. Then we get into the 80s and Smith & Wesson brings out their second-gen guns. Anyways, the technology, the bullet technology, of hollow point is still really in its infancy. Some guns don't even work well with them, right? So we're really in that realm of early doors, early days of this technology. And I bring that up because effectively it's believed, and I guess the reality is true, is that at that day, the 9mm 115 silver tip didn't do the job that they had hoped it would do. And the reason for that is because Murderer B, in the passenger seat, who had the Mini 14, was, as he was shooting and maneuvering, he was getting out of the car, as I recall, and one of the agent's rounds from the Smith & Wesson hit him. It hit him in his arm. It went through his arm into his side, perforated his lung, came all the way across, and just stopped short of his heart. Everybody believes, and I think it is believed, that that was a non-survivable wound. But due to his will to fight, which is a huge part of this, more on the part 3 part, and again, the fact that it didn't, a single round, a handgun round, is a good example. A single handgun round is probably not going to incapacitate someone. And in this case, it was a penetration issue. So he was able to continue to fight, obviously, wound up killing 2 agents. And at the end, all of the agents were wounded, right, in some form or fashion. Some were seriously wounded. Others had something more like, a severe hand wound, but all of them were wounded. And 2 were killed. And so there was a lot of attention put on this 9mm silver tip. And so what happened after this event is the FBI and the government, if you will, went into a really hard study on ammunition. And of course, that fed into handguns, but the ammunition itself and what didn't work that day. And one of the big things was the fact that to this point, there was a lot of discussion in law enforcement and ballistics, and for some reason for law enforcement, about the size, the circumference of the bullet and the wound channel. And in fact, there was even something, I think it was like an RII index or something like that. I'll have to look that back up before I get to the part 3. But there was this index about wound cavity. And we all know that now, and then their report after the fact concluded that this isn't really a thing. First of all, stopping power with a handgun and effective incapacitation with a wound channel isn't really a thing. And they've studied this over and over. And I think even we all continue to do these caliber wars, it always comes back to the same kind of analysis that the handgun round can't really do that. But it then got them to penetration. It kind of refocused them on, wait, what happened here? What didn't work? And they realized that, wait a minute, we are going to need a handgun round that has a certain level of penetration. And we all kind of use that now, right? It's the FBI, minimum 12-inch, 12 to 18. I don't remember the whole spec now, but the over penetration, which also I think is I don't want to say a myth, but I don't think it's anywhere near as prevalent or a thing as it's been made out to be. You just don't hear about that, right? How many times do you hear of an issue where someone was shot with a handgun round and that went through an entire person and then killed another person? I mean, I don't hear about that. I certainly hear missed shots hitting innocent people or something like that, where you missed a target, but through and through with a handgun round and then killing somebody else, I don't know. Maybe I'm not in the right data circles, but I just don't hear that. But again, back to this, the FBI and the government then realized, wait a minute, we've got a problem here. And the problem was really all of the ammunition on the market wasn't able to do that. In fact, I believe I read somewhere that all of the ammunition that day, the 9, the 38, and even the 357, would not have passed the current FBI protocol. And so it went to, as you folks know, it went to a 10 millimeter. The FBI, and it's in a report where the FBI felt that if they didn't take control of this topic, and or they couldn't rely on the ammunition companies to give them what they wanted, they really felt that they needed to take control of this. And they put all of their time and effort into the 10 millimeter. What's ironic with that statement is at the exact same time, Smith & Wesson is developing the 40 Smith & Wesson, and the two don't really talk. I mean, it's being done, as I've read, in parallel, which is very interesting. I don't know who maybe somebody had a bigger ego, maybe, I don't know, but it's just very interesting. And then we know, or maybe you don't, but part of the video is a discussion of this 10 millimeter. The agents were issued a Smith & Wesson, I think it was a 1076. It was a large frame, much larger than this, stainless steel handgun, much like the 4506, in 10 millimeter. And they very quickly started having trouble with that. First of all, the gun was very large, especially for small hand agents, and I have a small hand. The recoil was considerably more, I think, than maybe most of the general agents were expected. And then they actually started having trouble with the guns. There were stoppages and lockups. I can't remember if there were any extractor issues, but there were issues. I mean, to the point where the FBI finally dismissed the contract. They were like, we're done with this. We're not going to use this. And then at that time, or shortly after there, I don't remember the whole timeline sequence or what the overlap was, but the 40 Smith & Wesson came out with very, very similar ballistics to the 10 millimeter, but were able to be fired or utilized in just a standard, full size frame, but not one of these overly large frame handguns. So that's how the 10 millimeter and the 40, and so that's what we know. The 40 millimeter, or the 40 Smith & Wesson, I should say, it became, it became the bullet of choice for law enforcement because of all of this reporting. It's interesting to note that right after the shooting, and I'm talking, I think, within the year, 87, maybe 88, within 1 to 2 years, the FBI had already completed this analysis and came to the conclusion that, wait a minute, wow, penetration was really, really where we need to be, as we said, at least minimum of 12. if I remember right, and this is a current Winchester 115 grain. This isn't a box from 1986. This 38 Special, by the way, is a very old box. It might actually be very, very close, if not a 1980s version of the FBI load. But the 115 grain, back in that 86, I think when it was tested, I think it was only around an 8 or 9 inch penetration. Even with the first, I think the first Hydroshock from Federal, because again, everybody was trying to get ammunition moving up the technology train. Even the HST didn't perform that well, although it was a much better bullet than anybody had put out, really to that point for hollow point. So all of this again centers around this penetration and the ballistics side of it. But yeah, it's very, very interesting to see the analysis, and these reports you can find online. I mean, one of them is definitely, a couple of them are online. A number of them are open for public consumption now just because of the age of the event. But I guess my point was going to be, I drifted away from that a little bit. Shortly after the event, they realized they still needed to make a notation of what should agents be using. And they decided that looked like 45 ACP was a very good choice, but they also recognized the 147 grain. In fact, it's a Winchester grain. I even have the original box. Forgot I had it behind me. Goodness. This is the Winchester 147 grain subsonic jacketed hollow point. And this was the ammunition that the FBI approved, kind of the short-term fix, if agents were going to use 9mm. They were issued, and again, you're kind of pulling off the 10mm when that didn't work. What could be used as 9mm? It was going to be this Winchester 147 grain subsonic, also the same one that the SEALs used, but very similar, I should say. That was a Super Vel type of ammunition, but the 147 grain subsonic was the round that the SEALs were using in Vietnam, as we've talked about on this channel, or the 45 ACP. And there was a short stint there, as I remember, where the FBI also used SIG 228s and 229s, before they eventually moved into the 40 caliber Glock platform. Other really interesting things that I've read, especially when they did the analysis, they had a committee come together. And I think it was 2 years later, I think it was 88, engineers, medical people, all kind of a different kind of committee, bringing different experiences and things like that to the table. And generally it was agreed that the 9mm, if the bullet technology could get to a level that it would probably become the ideal platform, because of the gun, the ammunition capacity, shots on target, all the things that we talk about and like about 9mm today, believe it or not, were discussed and concluded around 1988. And there's even statements in that report, because I've read it, where they state that it might take 10, 15, 20 years for 9mm technology, bullet technology, to get it where they need to be. There's another reason they jumped and they felt they had to go to 10mm. They didn't think the cartridge companies, the ammunition companies, would get there fast enough, and they needed something today, so to speak. That's how they got to 10mm, and unfortunately it didn't really work out. But it's to me, it's very interesting in that report back in the late 80s that they were already quickly determining and had concluded that stopping power and wound channel and all of that really isn't a thing, and that 9mm looks like it would be a great choice if the bullet technology could get there. And lo and behold, what do we have about 30 years later, I guess? The FBI and law enforcement has gone back to 9mm, because generally it looks like the technology has gotten to the point where it's very close to 40 Smith & Wesson. Yep, there's some arguments about glass and metal and things like that, although I've looked at the federal chart where they line up all the ammunition, and all the ammunition runs across, what's its penetration and success through, clothing and gelatin and barriers and all that. And I have to admit, if the data is right on the page, the 9mm at this day and age, in 2025, whatever, last few years, last decade maybe, is really, really effective. And it's just really, really interesting to read a report from the 80s where they were almost looking into the future. I think it was one of the more surprising things I learned when I was researching this video, and really how we've gotten back to 9mm. So I think that's really what I wanted to talk about on the ballistic side. I'm sure I've missed something there, but really the summary is where the FBI analyzed what had happened, learned that this penetration topic or threshold was going to be the most important thing moving forward, and what they were doing collectively to try to get there. I think the ammunition manufacturers probably did a little bit better job for the market than they had given them credit for. I mean, when I read that one report, it was they just didn't think the ammunition manufacturers would get there at all. And one of the comments, and I don't remember who that was in that article, or committee, but it was a gentleman who was referring to hunting, and he's like explaining, you always heard in hunting, and I'm not a hunter, but people that hunt, that the bullet make it through the heavy fur carcass or whatever, in penetration, getting a bullet all the way through, or getting it to the heart of an animal. And he made a very good point. He's like, somehow that was completely omitted from bullet technology for self-defense or law enforcement. It was a very interesting comment. So yeah, that's the 800-pound gorilla in the room, was the Winchester silver tip 9mm 115 grain. I guess we should state too that that's not relevant today, right? I mean, you have 115 grain, I think, doing a pretty good job out there. It's interesting though that maybe that's another little quick point. So right after I mentioned to you, right after this event or shortly thereafter, the FBI felt they needed the 147 grain 9mm. I found it interesting that the FBI, when they went back to the 9mm a few years ago, once again chose 147 grain. I don't know how many people know that, because it's already changed a little bit. And I don't know exactly why it changed. It looks like now they're doing critical duty 135 grain plus P seems to be the round of choice. So there's a lot of attention around that today, around that critical duty 135 plus P. I think the federal HST 124 plus P is also a very respected round when we're talking about the latest 9mm technology. I don't remember all the grains in the HST line. I apologize. But I know, they do a lot of standard and plus P. So there'll be 124 and then 124 plus P. They might have a 135 and then a 135 plus P. I can't remember. There is 147 grain, and there is also 147 grain plus P, but I almost never see the plus P. But again, interesting that the FBI, 30 odd years later, when they go back to 9mm, initially picked 147 grain again. I kind of find that almost fascinating, and then had to switch. But I think it was a little bit more due to, and the gold dot too. I think the FBI also used the gold dot when they first came back to 9mm. But I think right now, what I hear is the critical duty 135 plus P. But so yeah, I think that's a good place to stop on the ballistics side. Let's get ready and jump into part 3, and we'll talk more about the story itself.